Hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Tim Strasser will defend the academic thesis Network Leadership for Transformative Capacity, Deepening, Widening and Lengthening the Impact of Social Innovation. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Welcome. Dear Prorector, dear members of the Corona, dear family, friends, and other humans tuning in online. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And thanks for celebrating with me the end of this 8-year-long journey of my PhD on how social innovation networks can deepen, widen, and lengthen transformative impact. At the core of my thesis is the intent to make theory more relevant and useful in practice for people working on better futures. So I would like to invite you to just imagine for this presentation that you are a change maker, if you're not already. So you might be a member of a local food cooperative. You might be part of an urban gardening project. You might be a member of a cooperative housing initiative, or a community-owned energy company. Maybe you're a part of a repair cafe upcycling old goods. Or maybe a part of a local community climate action center connecting all these kinds of initiatives. Or maybe you're part of a network that's connecting many of these initiatives all around the world. My thesis is intended to be useful for these kind of people. And you probably understand by now that the way that society is going is harming the planet and causing a lot of destruction to habitats of many life forms, and that we're transgressing many of the planetary boundaries within which we need to stay for a livable future. This requires deep transformations in our economic, political, and educational institutions. Now, on the one hand, there's a lot of destruction and harmful systems, both to people and planet. But at the same time, there's many innovations, there's many seeds of a different future. There's people creating different ways of relating, of being, that offer a possibility of how else we could live. And I have seen some of these. These already exist in many places around the world. The journey for me started visiting an eco-village in Tamera in Portugal, called Tamera, and joining the Green Office here in Maastricht University. And then joining the Transformative Social Innovation Theory project, which studied many of such kind of initiatives and tried to better understand how does social innovation contribute to large-scale transformative change. So the core idea here is that these social innovations that are happening in local places around the world are connected via networks and then interacting with larger established institutions like the welfare system, like capitalism and the economic institutions it's based on, and being both enabled by them and constrained by them and trying to challenge or replace them. Now, I found this theory still quite useful, but also quite abstract and difficult to apply in practice. And I am a practitioner myself. I was involved in the Green Office movement. And I found it quite difficult to really operationalize these theoretical insights. So I really wanted to bridge this gap between theory and practice through an action research project and tries to make TSI theory more applicable, more useful in practice. So the objectives of my research were twofold. On the one hand, I wanted to create a conceptual framework that's really grounded in empirics, in practice, and helps us understand what is actually transformative impact and how can network leadership practitioners, people supporting these kind of initiatives through networks, how can they build the capacity of those social movements, you could say, to have transformative impact. And secondly, to develop a practice tool to really operationalize this framework and helping these initiatives with their strategy and evaluation, and really test how it can be applied and for which benefits. I studied a variety of cases, mainly focusing on student-led and community-led sustainability initiatives, as well as some citizen-led peace-building initiatives. Now, my focus was not so much in these local initiatives as such, but more the networks that are connecting them on a national or international level, as well as the even larger scale networks that are connecting these networks in sort of bigger international movements. I also talked to some network leadership practitioners from a variety of networks to hear their views and get a more varied perspectives. Now, to bridge theory and practice, in my methodology, I made a number of choices. And first of all, in my first article, I conceptualized what I call the 3D framework. And this was based on TSI theory. It was based on some of the literature on scaling social innovation. It was based on my own experience in being a practitioner and some of the cases we looked at in the project of TSI theory. Now, in the second and third articles, I applied this initial, more hypothetical framework and tried to revise it and update it based on testing it in practice. And then in my fourth study, I turned this conceptual framework into a practice tool and tried to operationalize it and get feedback from actually applying it, making use of it. So I'll say a bit more about each of these studies now. In my first study, I conceptualized 3 dimensions of institutions. This idea of that all institutions, both the established ones and ones that we want to create, have width, depth, and length. So this means that established institutions like, let's say, neoliberal capitalism or the welfare state are very widely spread all around the world, and they're very deeply embedded in terms of incentive structures and their worldviews and policies, and they have a consistency over time, and they reproduce and adapt to changing situations. So based on these 3 dimensions, I developed also 3 layers of network leadership contributing to transformative capacity and then transformative impact in each of these. So in my second study, I really focused on transformative capacity and impact. And for instance, widening capacities are about expanding the reach to more diverse places and contexts and involving more diverse people in social innovations. The depth dimension is about having more fundamental, a deeper level of transformative impact in established rules and incentives and values and discourses. So this might involve doing advocacy or working with policymakers or other established organizations, challenging existing power structures. And the length is about the continuity, the persistence over time, but also the adaptation and evolution and learning and responding to contextual shifts. For instance, like the corona pandemic or other socioeconomic trends. Now, there's also an interaction between these 3 dimensions that can be beneficial or that they can be challenges. For instance, if you manage to embed a social innovation, let's say like the Green Office in policies and structures, that helps it to last over time, but not necessarily. There can also be barriers. For instance, if you're spreading an innovation more widely, oftentimes the depth can be challenged because people adapt it in different ways, and that means they're maybe not true to the original core principles anymore. And then in my third study, I dove into the network leadership piece that's at the center of this framework. So let's zoom in on that part. So I outlined 11 network leadership roles and more specific practices on how people perform these roles. But I also described how these roles, which are all interrelated with each other, contribute to these widening, deepening, and lengthening capacities. So for instance, the illuminator who's telling stories and looking at good practice examples might share these stories on social media and other public channels to make more visible what change is already happening, and then organizing events or offering trainings to people who want to get started and implement an eco-village or a green office, for instance. Network leaders might nourish relationships via community events or online platforms so that efforts can sustain over time and people can learn from each other and evolve over time. Or they can offer funding to strengthen longevity. The advocate, for instance, can help bridging to policymakers via shared policy positioning around, for instance, EU-level strategy agendas, or strengthening the embodiment of core values and principles. Now, in the fourth study, I then turned this framework into a practice tool. And what you can see here is a canvas on a virtual whiteboard called Miro, where people can then place post-its on the different elements in the framework to really contextualize it in their own network. I also applied this framework in various workshops, like here at an Eco-Village Festival, and testing it, getting people's feedback, and then also applying it in a longer-term project. This is from the Transition Together project in the UK, where I really helped them to make it part of their strategic planning, their evaluation, and reporting to their funders over a time span of 3.5 years. Now, I also studied the process of actually how to apply the model in practice. So the first step is to be more clear on what is the impact they actually want to have, and what are the outcomes they want to reach in each of those 3 dimensions. And then to define which roles and activities lead to those outcomes. So it's basically developing your theory of change. How are we going to get where we want to get? And then the 3rd and 5th steps are summarized here as monitoring and evaluation, so creating indicators for measuring progress towards your intended results, and using that data for learning and adapting over time, evolving your strategies to changing situations, and reporting to your funders and other stakeholders. And a kind of more poetic way of describing this process that I came up with was, on which journey are we to go? To find our way, what must we know? And hence make sense of which info. Now, the practical benefits that I've seen result from this study were, amongst others, just the simplicity of this language of deepening, widening, lengthening. And for many practitioners who don't have the time or the mental capacity to read long papers, just the simplicity of these 3 terms, they found it really fit intuitively with what they're trying to do, and evaluation didn't seem like something extra, something on top of what they're already trying to do. But at the same time, bringing a certain complexity with it if you want to go deeper. It also brings cohesion between many different projects and strategies to come together around how do all these different individual projects lead to widening or to deepening, or to lengthening. So it keeps alive also this impact orientation. And oftentimes projects get a bit lost in just doing the next project and losing track of why are we actually doing this? What's the long-term outcome we're working towards? And how can we adapt and evolve our strategies over time? There's a number of limitations that are important to consider, that I mainly used qualitative methods and didn't use much quantitative approaches. So the 3D framework could be critically revised and further developed through looking at many more diverse cases, also using quantitative methods. It could integrate a more deeper consideration of institutional change mechanisms and consideration of interactions with the context. And lastly, it could increase even more the practical and tactical guidance by giving practitioners more of a helping them to really apply it in a way that's viable. Sometimes they still felt it was a bit overwhelming to apply each and every aspect of the framework. So in conclusion, the 3D model and the tool based on it provides an intuitive and a useful in practice, and is relevant to a very wide variety of initiatives. It's not just based on community initiatives, but also movements working to change the economy or the welfare system or many others. And it makes the practice of network leadership, which was so far rather understudied, more visible and therefore also more fundable. That's all from me for today. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Dirk Loorbach, Professor of Socio-Economic Transitions at DRIFT, and that's part of the Erasmus University Rotterdam. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Rector. Yes, dear candidate, thank you very much for your thesis and also the presentation just now. My compliments for the boldness of bringing conceptual and practical together. As you know, I like that. I also really like the visual clarity and the simplicity of it. I think other members of the committee might challenge you on the practical use. I also have some questions, but I leave them to others, because I have some more theoretical, conceptual questions. Nothing as practical as a good theory, they say. But the question is, aren't you leading transformative social innovations into the woods? So I have a layered question, and I just want to have a discussion because I also don't know the answer, and I hope you can help. But maybe you can first start to be more precise in what you mean with institutions. You talk about institutions and institutionalizing a lot. And so can you give some examples of institutions and what you then mean with institutionalizing?
Sure, thank you for your question. Highly esteemed opponent. What I mean with institutions, it's basically like rules of how we behave. It can be formal rules, informal rules, or even more simply like collective habits. Like, I just thought of this yesterday actually. The good habits, they require a lot of effort and they get lost easily. The bad habits, they come easily and they're hard to change, right? And it's similar for collective institutions, institutions that are, let's say, welfare systems that are democratic and in the interests and based on care and solidarity. Those require a lot of efforts to build and to maintain, while other institutions that are economic decision-making based on competition and exploitation and not considering the welfare of other humans or other beings, those are kind of more often the default, and those are much more difficult to change.
So you refer to a wide variety of rules, ideas that somehow are mainstreamed in society. Is that how I can understand it? And as you know, in transitions research, the word regime is used quite often. Is it similar, your understanding of institutions, to what a regime is?
I would say it's quite similar to the idea of a regime, yeah. Okay,
then I think that's clear, because then the next question would be how to understand transition. Transformative social innovation are defined as ingredients for a transition. I would say that's also how I read your thesis. And a transition is defined as the regime change. Do you have a similar understanding of the notion of transition? Can you explain your understanding or give me your understanding of it?
Sure. So my understanding of transition is that it's often more specific to a certain subsystem of society, focusing on a mobility transition, how we get from carbon-based to renewable-based mobility system or energy system, educational system. So it's a bit more specifically focused in that sense. And so for me, institutional transformation, you could say, goes a level deeper in the sense of looking at the institutional logics that many of those societal subsystems are based on. Right? So you could say some of the dominant institutional logics are based on global trade or on the free market economy, and yeah, a change in institutional logic could be based on care, for instance, and equity, right?
Yeah.
And that there could be transitions within all of those subsectors that center care and equity.
Okay, so then I get to my real question, which is about the transformative and transformative social innovation. Also, in the examples that you just gave, they are about energy or food or local democracy. They seem to relate to a specific subsystem in society that they are supposedly intended to change with their innovation. Do I then misunderstand you? Are you now saying they are not about changes in subsystems of the economy, but are about something more fundamental?
I would say that the more immediately visible part of those innovations are the energy projects, are the car sharing, the food cooperatives. But similar to what I said before, there's an underlying quality of how people relate with each other, based on solidarity, on respect, on shared ownership. So for instance, you could also see it in the sense of the multi-actor perspective, right, where the dominant institutional logics are based on state or private ways of organizing through. And this is more of a shift towards community-based logic, where people come together as citizens to decide together on how they want to organize their food, their energy, and so on. Does that address your question?
It does to some extent, but I'm still puzzled. I look at the chair and I think I have some time to follow up, because my question would be then about transformative potential. In a way, what you're saying is that these form an alternative reality that just needs to grow. If I think, and I sympathize with that we have a sort of see a promising future there. So they're not transforming something that exists, but they're actually creating something that is fundamentally different. And I once had this conversation with people also related with these kind of social movements, and my proposition was, you all want to change the system, but not become the system. So can you reflect on this transformative potential?
Could you help me to understand the question a little more precisely?
Are you interested in these alternatives because they can change the existing economy, or they are basically something really alternative that is separate from the existing economy?
My interest in them is in their transformative potential, in the sense that they could, over time, replace or at least provide viable alternatives to many of the dominant institutions. I don't see it as a completely black and white shift, that some of the existing institutions still have a function to play and still will persist in the future. So I think that's where the complexity comes in, of how to maintain what works in existing institutions and how to integrate and adjust some of those prototypes of different ways of relating.
I think this helps to clarify. Thank you for this, because I read a lot of your framework as a helpful tool for these initiatives to mainstream into the existing institutional context and by modifying them, but it's actually about building a different future altogether.
Yeah, in a way, I would see it like the metaphor of the Trojan horse, right? That these initiatives, some of them are more radical than others, of course, and some are more easily, let's say, integrated within existing systems and have less of a transformative ambition, and others really try to offer a completely different way of being human on this planet, right? And they maybe still need funding and still need support from institutions, and they won't give you the depth of what they're trying to do at first hand to get access to some of those resources. No. But over time, they want to fundamentally change the system.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Julia Wittmeyer, and she is an associate professor of social innovation and action research, also at DRIFT at Erasmus University. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, it's really great to see you here standing, having a achieved this remarkable step of delivering this PhD thesis and a great presentation. After we started like years ago at part of the Transit project, so I'm really happy to see that. I was also happy to see that as part of the reworking of your thesis, you also addressed a number of the comments that I gave on the methodological and epistemological positioning. And since I'm here in opposition, I have some more questions about that, if you allow. So first of all, action research, as you know, is embedded within practice, right? So it raises important questions about the relationship between knowledge and action, but also in the ways in which practical and academic insights kind of interact, and then your positionality as an action researcher in that. And in your thesis and also in your presentation, you said that you are using this embedded action research approach, and that you are, contributing to academic knowledge. We have the PhD thesis and the articles, but you have a strong emphasis on being the practical value of your 3D framework. There, you say, for example, that the differentiation of the levels in the framework was not further developed because practitioners did not see added practical value. So this focus on adding value, but also seeing to see when it's not practical or useful anymore. So I have a seemingly very simple question that came up for me there is, how did you determine when something was practical or useful enough in the context that you were researching?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. Yeah, it's a good one. I agree that my overall tendency was to be focused on what is practical. I think I did interact with the literature on scaling, and I think it also makes a contribution there, so it was not only focused on practice. I definitely felt there is also more coherence in the literature that is needed in a way for it to be also useful in practice, but also for many different concepts of scaling in, scaling up, scaling out, deepening, broadening, to have more simplicity or coherence, as well as what we mean with transformative capacity. So my intent was not only to focus on the practice side, but mainly. Does that sufficiently answer your question?
Yeah, partly. I completely acknowledge what you're saying, so it's really clear what your academic contribution is as well. But I was wondering around, when you were working as an action researcher in those settings and you were adapting your framework, what was your sense or your reflections about this is now practical enough? When did you deem it practical enough and useful enough for the people, or in this context that you were working in, aiming to support those initiatives to grow, get longer and deeper? Yeah.
Well, I think it's still not practical enough. Okay. I think there's still more work to do. Mm-hmm. I think it's good enough for now, but yeah, I welcome further testing and exploration.
Yeah. And what is why do you say this? What's the argument behind it? Why do you say it's not practical enough? What's your reflection on that?
Some of the practitioners have still said they found, even though they found the deepening, widening, lengthening language mm-hmm. very simple and intuitive, mm-hmm. some of the more detailed parts of it, because I only sketched the very high level part of the framework. You can zoom into many different more specific aspects, and the language used there is sometimes maybe still a bit abstract. Yeah. Yeah. And also quite overwhelming, because there's, I think, around 30 specific elements in the framework in total. And to then think about each of those and how do our strategies contribute to all of them, yeah, that was still a bit overwhelming. So having a more, I think it has to do also with experience of applying the tool more in different situations and seeing how do you help people prioritize what to focus on at which stage of their development.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so you basically were taking the judgment by the people you were working with as a main indicator for yourself that this is now getting towards being practical enough. Is that a summary of what you're saying?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. My own experience also had a role to play, because, I mean, mm-hmm. as I mentioned, I'm also a practitioner, and I was trying to always keep in mind, is this workable for my own practice, as well as for the people I've been testing the tool with? Yeah,
because if we take this and you then go to the role that you're having as an action researcher, would you agree that it is also your role to challenge those people that you're working with in the kind of framing that they're using, and not going with, oh, now it's not, this is too unpractical, it's too theoretical, but also challenge them in the ingrained ways that they're thinking or doing. So I wonder, like, where does your own judgment come in saying, okay, you think it's not practical enough, but at the same time, I don't think it's transformative enough what you're doing. So how does that work for you?
I think it kind of speaks to the role of being a reflexive monitor, you could say, or being a developmental evaluation practitioner, which is how the tool is intended to be used.
Yeah.
And so it's trying to be like a critical friend, right? It's like trying to be generally supportive of the cause they're working towards, while still bringing a critical view of, are you really deepening with doing X, Y, Z, challenging assumptions, and helping practitioners to articulate their assumptions, which are often very implicit, right? And to create a theory of change that is sometimes quite vague, or that people have different understandings that don't match, to make it explicit and make it testable. So there's this rigor that I do hope I have brought, and I think the model can be used in that way. But
yeah. So it's that critical angle of helping them to reflect on what it is that they're doing in order to increase their transformative impact.
Yeah, and I think part of the deepening is to become aware of one's blind spots or unconscious biases, right? So it's becoming aware of how we're still institutional, we're an embodiment of some of those mainstream institutions in how we think and how we interact with each other. So,
great. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Harro van Lente. And he is a professor of science and technology study at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at this university.
Thank you. Thank you, dear candidate. I also would like to congratulate you with this very clear and inspiring thesis. Also, in your presentation now, it really shows that you're able to deal with, starting with simple ideas and then make it deeper and widen and lengthen it more in terms of concepts. So that is really...
it's working. People are starting to use the language.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Indeed. So that is one of your claims as well, that you provide a platform for exchange. We will continue. So that is very, very good. I also really like that you really try to use this simple language for practices, but still sometimes we have to think about the language itself and whether it really can accumulate in an academic sense. So I have a question about some terms, and I start with this term of network leadership. So you define it as something, and I quote, "It is a distributed practice performed by a range of individuals and organizations who support and enable transformative capacity development in networks." So it is something that supports and enables transformative capacity. Okay, and then your research question is, how can network leadership contribute to developing transformative capacity? So something that by definition is something that supports and enables transformative capacity. Your question is, how can it do that? So that sounds as if, yeah, by definition, it is already doing that. So why would you still raise that question as if the definition already gives the answer? So that is my first question.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for this question. I would say that... Sorry, I just forgot your question for a second. Can you just repeat one more time some keywords?
You define network leadership as something that supports or that contributes to capacity development, and then your question, how can this something that contributes to transformative capacity, how can it contribute to transformative capacity?
So network leadership can be defined in a way that does not directly refer or assume a contribution to transformative capacity. So I agree that it could have been defined in more neutral terms, and there are network leadership practitioners in various kinds of networks who are maybe not intending to transform anything, but they just seek to reinforce or innovate within the existing economic systems. I would say I defined network leadership in the context of my thesis and building on transformative social innovation theory And then the question was, how do they actually do that in practice? So I wanted to get a more detailed understanding of how do network leadership practitioners actually help build those transformative capacities.
Yeah, no, I can see that, so thank you very much. I have a follow-up question on this. You already also now mentioned in your presentation you have been working on this for 8 years. The world has changed. There are so many other forces at play now, while as we speak. So also populist ideas, conservative agendas. So my question is, and so I also look at the cases you studied, which is about green office, community activities, or energy corporations, things like that. How useful would your framework be for someone with another agenda, say conservative agenda or populist? Or so how can you use this framework for restoring family values and traditional gender roles? And then you need to deepen, widen, lengthen, and so on. So you could even go further with, say, how would Elon Musk use this and things like that. Well, we won't go there. But in principle, this is, a tool that is maybe quite powerful. And so my question is, how dangerous is your tool?
Well, if Elon Musk would start using it, then I would be quite happy because I'd probably earn a lot of money with it. No, I'm kidding.
Not sure.
So the tool in itself, although my intent is for it to serve transformative movements with a certain value orientation towards regenerative systems and serving life, I cannot prevent anyone from using that framework for other agendas. I mean, I would say that overall they still apply to some degree, no matter what sort of transformation you're trying to work towards. I think there are some capacities that I speak to in the framework about challenging established power structures, for instance, that maybe in that case wouldn't be the case because it's actually reinforcing existing power structures. So I think I mentioned that I'm coming from an ethical framework of supporting life-serving institutions, while the framework as such could be used by other kind of agendas.
Okay.
And I wouldn't see an option of how to prevent that. If you have an idea, please let me know.
Well, I'm not sure. So, I mean, it's an open question. You start with your cases with this concern about sustainability. And that is, well, sustainability is then, as we notice, so entangled with so many other things. So you have to have a broader, quite passing idea of how to change that. But then sustainability is no longer in your title, but it's somehow still in the way you see it. So I could also phrase my question, how much is the idea of sustainability part of this idea of network leadership and the change directions that you study? Or is it really a neutral tool that can be applied to anything?
So I think for me, the idea of sustainability, you could say, is a little outdated, or has been used in many different ways. So it has been co-opted, let's say, by the powers that be, right? So I think regeneration is maybe a more useful concept that really speaks to this idea of regenerating the conditions for life that are being destroyed or that are being harmed. So I think that's kind of where I'm coming from with how I understand sustainability, or how I intend this tool to be used.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Ron Curvers. He is Associate Professor of Governance for Sustainable Development at the Maastricht Sustainability Institute at this university.
Dear candidate, dear Tim, good to see you today. You're back in Maastricht. You already mentioned it was quite a long ride, but my impression is usually it takes time to deliver quality. So congratulations with your PhD thesis. I want to talk a bit with you about the title of your thesis, the leadership. You focus on the leadership. And if you look to the leadership, as supporting learning and social innovations, I was wondering, you look to leadership as a single actor, and while if you look into the literature, you could say, okay, there are many factors which have an impact on leadership. You can think about, do you have time, do you have resources, what is happening in the network you try to lead. So can you maybe explain a bit more why you simply look to leadership in such a very narrow way? That's my question.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. So leadership, I see it as a distributed practice enacted by many people or even organizations in these networks. And for me, that was, given the centrality in transformative social innovation theory of these networks in supporting the transformational agency, that seemed like the most sensible empirical focus point, and not negating, of course, that there's many other factors that have a role to play in whether or not those social movements realize their transformative potential, or of course policy issues, funding scarcity, all these other contextual factors have a key role to play, whether or not, or in which way those movements develop. I just sought to focus on what is within the realm of agency of people who are active in stewarding these networks to build those capacities.
No. But can you lead without these resources? I mean, it's a little bit maybe a chicken and an egg discussion.
Well, that's why one of the network leadership roles is the resource provider, right? Or resource generator.
To accumulate the resources.
Sorry, come again?
To bring the resources together. That's what you are aiming for as a leader.
Yeah, I mean, so these initiatives are generating their own resources to some extent, either from public funding or selling services or giving courses. And the role of network leadership can be to access resources that are not available on a local level.
Yeah.
For instance, EU level funding, and helping to distribute that to the grassroots.
Yeah. And if you take this, how, as you describe it, this network leadership, do you believe or think they are unique for social innovations? Or could it also be applied, let's say, in other contexts? Think about other actors, or maybe even about, I don't know, political parties. So is it unique for social innovations, that network leadership, or also applicable in other contexts?
I would say they're applicable in other contexts. I mean, I didn't study this, and this would be definitely a fruitful research agenda to study this in more detail. I would imagine that many of the roles are applicable to other kinds of networks.
And what would your work then make unique?
For me, I think it's about how it all comes together in a coherent and integrated framework, and how, the way of looking at network leadership roles in relationship to building transformative capacities in 3 dimensions. And there might be other network leadership roles that you could add or subtract from the framework that are more applicable to different kind of networks.
Yeah.
We have time for a second round of questions, so I would like to give the floor again to Dr. Julia Wittmar. First, we go to Professor Dirk Loorbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ladies first, I thought, but it's... well, thank you, dear candidate. It's very helpful already, this discussion. In the first round, I questioned you a bit about the absence of transition. I want to now maybe focus on the absence of another typical thing that we see a lot in transition literature, but is hardly mentioned in your thesis, which is policy. So, and it relates also a bit to the previous question. A lot of these initiatives, they are, let's say, underappreciated or being frustrated in their local environment by existing policy frameworks. Permits that don't work for eco-villages, funding schemes that are not applicable to social initiatives, electricity market regulations that don't allow for community exchange of energy. So in quite some use of the words institutions, people refer to those, let's say, government-imposed regulations that are, let's say, facilitated by policymakers. So in the process of mainstreaming or institutionalizing, somehow these initiatives encounter policymakers. And can you reflect a bit on what your thesis means for dealing with this policy context? Because in a way you could argue you help these initiatives grow in absence of policy.
Well, I think policy is definitely a key part of the framework in terms of the deepening capacity, talking about strategically interacting across sectors, both with the public sector and the private sector. Maybe it could have been more explicit there that advocacy and lobbying, interacting with policymakers is part of that. And one of the network leadership roles is the advocates, which is really precisely about this point. And one of the cases I studied, Ecolis, was really founded actually by its members with the intent to be that bridge towards policymakers.
Yeah, but if we critically look to those kind of attempts, and especially taking your definition of institutions as a fundamental worldview, values, or there is a fundamental clash, and they might have some impacts with lobbying. But they might only ensure their own survival as a niche, but not the Trojan horse kind of pattern that you referred to earlier. Or do you have examples of where that policy interaction actually leads to transforming government institutions?
So I think in the eco-village movement, there was an example of the ministry in, I think it was Senegal, that adopted an eco-village development program as part of the ministry. And this needs to be double-checked because I'm not sure how factual or like how, if this still is alive, let's say, but there has been instances like this where it becomes what eco-villages want, or a transition network becomes part of local level council policy in the municipality or national level, or with Ecolis also they managed to build those relationships with members of the European Parliament and place some of they created a manifesto for community-led collective action, which is slowly finding its ways into different parts of, let's say, members of the European Parliament joining events and being open to this and supporting it with their signatures. And of course, this takes time, right?
And do you think that this is the recommended strategy? I know one also successful example of Racecoop, the energy cooperative collective that lobbied for allowing energy cooperatives on the grid as energy companies. They did so successfully at the European Union, and they actually changed the law. So there are maybe these kind of incidental successes, but do you think this is the way forward? Because it's slow, it's cumbersome, it's a real uphill battle. Or is there another route to transformation?
If there is, please let me know. I haven't found one yet. I would imagine that this is part of a very broad strategy portfolio that it's hard to avoid working with policymakers and with institutional actors. And you could say one of the strategies is to just, some of the initiatives are quite radical and say we don't want to have anything to do with these established actors. And in my personal view, I think that might limit their transformative potential. But this is not something I studied in detail. And
actually a scenario that you raised, and I think you contradict yourself when you mentioned the Trojan horse, you contradicted yourself with the definition of transformation as building an alternative reality. And one alternative narrative would be that the capitalist fossil economic system is already collapsing real time at the moment.
Sure.
So it's not about Trojan horsing, it's about saving ourselves, and maybe those transformative social innovations are lifeboats.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think my own personal view of large-scale change, it might just come down to these initiatives being there when the established systems are collapsing and the dominant system is just not an option anymore. Could be that that happens. Right now it seems like it's just reinforcing and becoming even stronger, but it might, some people say that we are in a sort of catalytic moment in the history of human evolution, where in one scenario established systems collapse, as many civilizations have.
If we assume that hypothesis, would you have 3 other dimensions to your framework for these social innovations?
For me, it applies in the same way. I mean, these initiatives, by widening, by spreading and being embedded in many different places and cultures, they are increasing the likelihood that in the case of such collapse scenarios, that there are these seeds of an alternative in the soil, and that these can grow when the cement structures crumble, then these seeds can come through. And there is studies on some of the key factors in responding to crisis situations of flooding or wildfires is the strength of community relationships. More important than the economic situation of that place, the strength of social ties were the main predictor of survival and of rebuilding after crisis situations. So I think this speaks to the transformative potential of many of these community initiatives.
Thanks.
Thank you for your question.
Then the opposition will be continued by Dr. Julia Wittmeyer.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. I want to go on a bit with where Dirk left off. So you introduced TSI, so Transformative Social Innovation Theory, saying that it's the extent to which social innovations challenge, alter, and replace the dominant system, right? The system that is the dominant societal structures, practices, and institutions. But you also say they are living within that system, right? They have to kind of survive within that system. And then therefore like kind of become hybrids, like blending in, but also wanting to establish that radical core. Now, in the limitations to your framework, you are saying that the politics and power dynamics, you have put limited attention to those in the framework. So I wonder now, when this is a struggle, which is really about a power struggle and a struggle of politics and whose agenda is going to be put up, how can you put limited attention to it, and how can the framework then be useful in the end? So if you don't put attention to the power aspects that are kind of intrinsic in this whole social innovation transformation, how can then this framework be useful to practice, rather than kind of being instrumental? Yeah.
Thank you for the question. What comes to mind most immediately is at the intersection between funders and grantees, that this is one particular power dynamic you might think of that is very often present, right? As social innovations are often dependent on receiving public funding or foundation grants, how to deal with the power that these funders have over what is being funded and how they're being held to account to deliver on what they promise. So I think in this situation, that for me is an example of where the model can help to both to communicate to funders on what kind of evaluation is needed and what is their core intent, and to help to have a dialogue with funders about what's actually needed for funding transformative systems change. But I'm not sure if that's fully answering your question.
Yeah, I was wondering,
difficult.
It is in an empirical way. I was also wondering to which extent you actually blend out the politics and power, because you say it's a limitation. Is it, and to which extent, and what is it that you would like to build into your framework that that you're still missing in a way? Yeah.
I mentioned one of the shortcomings and potentials for further research are the specific tactics of like how to actually enact some of the capacities I speak to. Right? One of the capacities I talk about is challenging established power structures. And because my framework was more of a holistic, large-scale view, I didn't have the capacity to focus in so much on any of those individual ones. But I think that would be a very rich further research avenue to really look at the details of how do these actors navigate those power dynamics and what capacities help them to navigate them more skillfully or to lead to results that are more in the interests of their transformative ambitions.
Do you have an empirical example for me from your studies for those strategies, for these navigation strategies that they have been using?
Well, as I said, I didn't study that in detail, but something that comes up was, let's see. Yeah, I think in the context of Equalise, the European Network of Community-Led Initiatives, they have built relationships with members of the European Parliament already for many years to really try to get their foot in the door or to have a seat on the table, so to say. And then they always have a sort of debrief after some of those like policy events where they actually speak with those members of Parliament, or they debate in their general assemblies on some of those policy strategies and to what extent they should connect to them, how they can connect to them, to what extent they can challenge them, right? So these are discussions that are happening on an ongoing basis, and especially if there's capacity available for really engaging with these kind of, at this interface of policy and innovations.
Great, thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Har van Lente.
Dear candidate, I would like to have a question about learning. So this is a central concept, of course, in your thesis, and in chapter 2 you develop a proposition on learning, and in chapter 6 you say, well, I was not able to really test them, but they are testable. But I would like to challenge you there. So the proposition 4 reads, barriers for learning are likely to be higher across networks than within networks, given the differences in values, perspectives, and identity. So within the network, barriers are low. Outside the networks, barriers are higher. And that comes across as quite plausible, yet from innovation studies, that studies how firms collaborate and how they learn from each other, there is this notion of cognitive distance, and that indeed firms that are in the same sector, they might feel quite comfortable amongst themselves because they have the same values, perspectives, and identities, yet learning is less high because there's no difference there. And also when the cognitive distance is too high, then there's no possibility to learn because they lack language and perspectives and so on. So there is this optimal point, so the inverted U. So you need to have some distance. So I think that will challenge your proposition, and I also think that in your cases, so Equalise and Jan Netherlands, some of these cases also with the Green Office, there are some indications that indeed learning happens because there is some distance. So what do you think of that? Would it challenge your proposition or not?
Thank you for your question. If I understand correctly, you're referring to the proposition of the research agenda in my second chapter rather than one of the 10 propositions of the thesis itself. And I chose to not focus, to actually abandon the social learning layer of the framework. In the initial draft, there was 4 layers rather than 3. And because I felt the social learning piece requires a whole PhD in itself, right? Because it's quite a complex topic to address. So some of those propositions were more based on initial observations that maybe it's easier to learn within an established community of friends.
Tim Strasser, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
Thank you very much.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. The mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. To the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. What's on the line? I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Tim Strasser, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Kemp Professor Kemp is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Please, all rise.
I didn't bring the text. De tekst ligt nog in de toga-kamer. Nou, hoeveel promoties? Bij machte van. Mooi wel.
Well, you know the results.
Curious, have you ever failed somebody at a defense?
No, you're challenging the committee. We already have told you the results.
Yeah, I'm curious if it ever happened.
Before this one.
Dankjewel. In English, yeah? Yeah. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible? Do you promise?
Yes, I promise.
Okay, then by the authority invested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Tim Strasser, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Here it is, and congratulations.
Please be seated.
Yes, there's a little more to come, and I'm speaking here on behalf of Joop. We both supervised you in 9 or 8 years. We don't know exactly. I think it started in 2016 or 17. Looking back, it took a while for you to find the direction for your PhD research. But once you settled on a course when working on the first paper, you never deviated from it during the rest of your PhD directory, resulting in an exceptionally focused thesis. You were like a ballistic missile. You know, really, sort of on one track. And you knew very well the direction you wanted to go, but frequently there were long pauses after completing a paper. And one reason for this, we think, is that you tend to be too critical of your own work, as you indicated yourself. You need hard submission deadlines to overcome these self-created obstacles. So this says something about you as a person, but well, there's also nothing wrong with being thoughtful and reflective. Those are also words that were used to describe you and your defense. Well, this worked very well with the first 3 papers. which were published in special issues. But the fourth paper, of which we thought it was not necessary to have this also published, because, well, it was supposed to speed up the finalization of the thesis, but the opposite effect was achieved, as there were no more real hard deadlines. It was published nonetheless, but through an extraordinary process. First of all, the journal it was submitted to rejected the paper right away, to our great disappointment. Then the next day, it turned out to be a mistake. The journal had sent a wrong decision letter and in fact wanted very much to take the paper forward. Unfortunately, one of the reviewers was very critical of the paper and did not accept the rebuttals. The argument, I think, was that there was not the tool was not evaluated but only applied. The editor, on the other hand, took a different view and really wanted to publish the paper in this journal and considered it quite useful or very valuable for practitioners. He went as far as to offer to edit the paper himself so that it could be accepted for publication, which he did, both the editing and the acceptance. Well, no one will believe you if you tell this to others. And I can also tell the other PhD students here, don't expect this. Don't expect the editor to rewrite your paper so that he can accept it. This happens only once in a million times. The last step to complete your thesis, the propositions, turned out to be really difficult for you. The whole idea of making somewhat provocative and debatable statements on topics outside of your thesis did not resonate with you at all. And we had a hard time convincing you to include at least a few propositions that did not include the words 3 dimensions, 3D framework, or transformative social innovation. I even offered 3 suggestions to you, one of which was "The Nile ain't just a river in Egypt" from Mark Twain, but you didn't want to use them. Now, no offense, Tim, here, but I don't think you are carved out for comedy as a stand-up comedian. But being so serious and sort of wanted to say things well, but you're very well to prove me wrong. Tim, I got to know you for at least 10 years because you worked for me as a research assistant and also was involved in the Transit project with Julia. And in those years, I got to know you a little better, but not a lot. I remember we stayed in an R&B in Copenhagen together, about which I could tell a nice story, not about the R&B, but what happened there. But I will not. I will keep that for dinner. Well, Tim, a long journey. You probably know what I was alluding to. A long journey has ended. We all got a little older and wiser, I think. At least we look a little older. Your work was appreciated not only by the committee, but also by others. It received quite a few citations already, and also practitioners considered a useful framework. So that's what I would call a double success. So you can be proud of that. As a young doctor, you now can embark on a new journey. Maybe not as a comedian or an institutional scholar, but perhaps as a trainer or network weaver. Whatever you will do, well, whatever you will do, I think you will always be Tim, honest and serious, which is fine, nothing wrong with that. Well, my time is over, the 6 minutes. The pro-rector is already looking at me, and I think we all can use a drink. So why don't we do just that? With everyone who fancies a drink and wants to congratulate you on your success and wishing you best as young Dr. Tim. And I will end now in German. Hop, hop, hurra!
Dear Dr. Strasser, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. And I close this session. As a committee and candidate and paralymps, we will first have a photo session on the stairs in the hall of this building, and then we'll join the audience for a drink, and you can already go to the rafter. We will leave the room first.
Please all rise. Dr. Tim, please come forward. Parliament, please bring the degree.
All of the degree.
Supervisor.